The wind at night did not merely blow, it shrieked across the plains of the Montana Territory, a vengeful spirit seeking any crack in the armor of the living to slip its icy fingers through. In the center of this white, swirling purgatory, a splash of pale pink fabric fluttered against the snow, a fragile flower doomed to wither in the frost. Mai sat slumped against the rough bark of a dormant oak tree, her breath hitching in shallow, painful clouds. She was 25 years old, though the hollowness of her cheeks and the terror in her dark, almond eyes made her look far younger, like a child discarded by a cruel world. The light pink prairie dress she wore, once a garment of hope for a marriage that was promised to save her family, was now little more than a rag, torn at the hem and soaked through with the biting melt of the snow. Beside her lay a crude wooden walking stick, polished smooth by the grip of her desperate hands. It was her only companion, her only means of dragging her paralyzed legs across the unforgiving earth. She had been cast out not 3 hours prior, thrown from the back of a merchant's wagon when her intended husband, a man who saw women only as livestock, discovered that her legs would not carry his buckets nor stand for his beatings. He had looked at her useless limbs with disgust, declared her broken goods, and left her to the mercy of the winter. Mai tried to pull her thin shawl tighter, but her fingers were stiff, blue-tipped and clumsy. The cold was no longer a sensation, it was a heavy, narcotic weight pressing her eyelids down. She thought of her home across the ocean, of the warmth of a rice steamer, memories that felt like they belonged to a different lifetime. Here, there was only the grey sky and the judgment of a town that had watched her be abandoned and turned its back, locking its doors against the crippled stranger. She was starving, her stomach a knotted cramp of emptiness that had long ago stopped rumbling and started aching with a dull, constant throb. The world was fading into a white blur, and Mai gripped her stick, not to move, but to have something to hold as the darkness came for her. The vibration traveled through the frozen ground before the sound reached her ears, a rhythmic, heavy thudding that spoke of immense power. Mai did not look up, she lacked the strength to lift her head, assuming it was a wolf come to finish what the cold had started. But the thudding stopped, replaced by the snort of a beast and the creak of leather. A shadow fell over her, blocking the biting wind, and for a moment, there was a reprieve from the stinging gale. A man sat atop a massive black destrier, a horse that looked as if it had been carved from the midnight sky itself. The rider was a mountain of a man, his shoulders broad enough to block out the sun, clad in a heavy buffalo hide coat that dusted the snow. His face was hidden beneath the brim of a battered Stetson, but the lower half revealed a jaw set like granite and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. This was Thorn. The townspeople whispered his name in hushed, fearful tones, calling him a hermit, a brute, a man who possessed more land than God and a heart made of iron. They said he had no use for people, that he preferred the company of wolves and silence. Thorn looked down at the bundle of pink rags shivering against the tree. He did not speak immediately. His eyes, the color of stormy seas, took in every detail, the twisted angle of her legs, the walking stick fallen from her grip, the frost clinging to her raven hair. He saw the starvation etched into her jawline, the way her collarbones protruded sharply against the thin fabric of her dress. A lesser man might have offered a prayer and ridden on. A kind man might have offered a coin. Thorn did neither. He swung his leg over the saddle, his boots hitting the snow with a crunch that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. He loomed over her, a terrifying giant, but when he crouched, the movement was surprisingly fluid. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask what happened. He knew the cruelty of men well enough to read the story written on her skin. He simply reached out, his hands encased in thick leather gloves, and scooped her up. She weighed nothing, a bird made of hollow bones and sorrow. Mai gasped, a tiny, fractured sound, as she was lifted high into the air, expecting violence, but finding herself pressed against the rough, warm wool of his coat. The journey was a blur of sensory contradictions for Mai, drifting in and out of consciousness as the horse thundered across the plains. She was suspended between the freezing death of the air and the furnace-like heat of the man holding her. Thorn held her against his chest with one arm, a band of iron that kept her from slipping, while his other hand guided the horse with practiced ease. He rode not toward the town, but away from it, climbing the rugged trails that led toward the jagged peaks of the mountains. The wind howled louder here, frustrated that it could not reach the prize it had claimed, blocked by the massive form of the rancher. Mai could smell him, a scent of pine needles, cured tobacco, and the musk of a wood stove. It was a masculine, earthy smell that terrified her and comforted her all at once. She felt the rumble of his chest as he murmured low commands to his horse, a deep baritone that vibrated through her freezing bones. Every jolt of the horse sent a spike of pain through her paralyzed legs, but the warmth seeping from him was bringing sensation back to her extremities, a prickly, burning agony that told her she was still alive. They climbed for what felt like hours, leaving the grey slush of the valley for the pristine, untouched white of the high country. Finally, the rhythm of the horse changed, slowing to a walk. Through her half-closed eyes, Mai saw a structure rising from the snow, not a house, but a fortress of timber and stone. Smoke poured from a stone chimney, painting a grey streak against the darkening sky. It was the only light in a world of shadow. Thorn did not wait for a stable hand, he had none. He rode straight to the main porch, the wood groaning under the weight of the horse. He dismounted with her still in his arms, shielding her head from the falling snow with his hand. As he kicked open the heavy oak door, the roar of the wind was instantly silenced, replaced by the crackle of a massive hearth. He carried her across the threshold, a king carrying a broken queen into a castle she did not know she had inherited. Inside, the sensory shift was violent and overwhelming. The air was thick with heat, smelling of cedar and roasting meat. Thorn bypassed the grand furniture of the main hall, carrying Mai straight to a large bearskin rug in front of a fireplace large enough to roast a whole deer. He knelt, placing her down with a gentleness that belied his size. The firelight danced across the room, illuminating walls adorned with the tools of his trade, rifles, lassos, and maps of his vast territory. But Mai saw none of his wealth, she saw only the fire. She tried to drag herself closer to the heat, her walking stick left behind on the saddle, her legs trailing uselessly behind her. Thorn watched her for a second, his jaw tightening, before he moved into action. He was a man of few words, believing that language was often a veil for lies, while action was the only truth. He disappeared into a side room and returned with thick wool blankets and a basin of warm water. He knelt beside her, his large frame blocking the drafts. "Sit," he commanded. His voice was gravel, rough and unused, but not unkind. It was an instruction, not a threat. Mai froze, her eyes wide with fear, but she obeyed, propping herself up on trembling arms. Thorn reached out and began to unbutton the frozen, wet boots from her feet. His hands, calloused from years of ranching and fighting the land, moved with surgical precision. He stripped away the wet stockings, revealing feet that were pale and blue-veined, the skin icy to the touch. He took a rough cloth dipped in the warm water and began to scrub the circulation back into her limbs. Mai flinched, expecting pain, but his touch was rhythmic and firm. He did not look at her legs with the disgust her intended husband had shown, he looked at them as one would look at a damaged fence or a sick calf, something that required fixing, something that required care. After wrapping her in the blankets until she looked like a cocoon of wool, he went to the iron pot hanging over the fire. He ladled out a bowl of broth, the steam rising in lazy spirals. He held it to her lips. "Drink," he said. She took a sip, and the flavor of rich beef and herbs exploded in her mouth, so intense after days of starvation that tears pricked her eyes. She drank greedily, some of the broth spilling onto her chin. Thorn did not scold her, he simply wiped it away with his thumb, his eyes lingering on her face for a moment longer than necessary. The morning light broke through the heavy velvet curtains, slicing across the room in beams of dust motes and gold. Mai woke with a start, her heart hammering against her ribs, instinctively reaching for her walking stick before realizing she was not in the snow. She was in a bed, a massive four-poster bed made of dark mahogany, buried under layers of down quilts. The mattress was softer than anything she had ever touched, sinking under her slight weight. For a moment, she thought she had died and gone to the ancestors, but the dull ache in her paralyzed legs grounded her in reality. She pushed herself up, her arms shaking. The room was silent, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. She looked down at herself. She was wearing a clean, oversized flannel shirt that smelled of him. Her pink dress was gone. Panic flared in her chest, but then she looked out the window. The view was breathtaking, miles of snow-covered valley, pine trees bowing under white caps, and in the distance, herds of cattle moving like a dark river across the white land. And there was Thorn. He was outside, stripped to his shirt sleeves despite the freezing air, swinging an axe with rhythmic, terrifying power. He was splitting logs, the wood exploding apart with every strike. Mai watched him, mesmerized. He moved with a competence that was almost hypnotic, his body a machine of muscle and leverage. He stopped, wiping sweat from his brow, and looked up at the window, as if he could feel her gaze. Their eyes locked through the glass. He didn't wave or smile. He simply drove the axe into the chopping block and walked toward the house. Moments later, the door to the bedroom opened. He filled the frame, bringing the cold air in with him. He held a tray with fresh bread, cheese, and coffee. He set it on the bedside table. Mai found her voice, raspy and unused. You saved me," she whispered, her English broken and accented. "I have nothing to pay you." "I am." Broken. Thorn looked at her, his expression unreadable. He poured the coffee, the dark liquid swirling in the china cup. He looked at her useless legs hidden under the quilt, then up to her eyes, which burned with a fierce, terrified pride. "I didn't ask for payment," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to settle in the floorboards. "And you ain't broken." Just bent. He turned to leave, pausing at the door. "Eat. You're too thin. The wind will blow you away, and I ain't chasing you down again." Weeks turned into a season of quiet transformation, the harsh winter slowly yielding to the tentative, weeping thaw of early spring. The cabin, once a fortress of solitude for Thorn, had become a sanctuary of shared silence and subtle rhythms. Mai, though her legs remained still and lifeless, found that her hands held a magic of their own. She insisted on earning her keep, refusing to be a mere guest in the house of the man who had pulled her from the snow. She took to mending Thorn's clothes, her needle flashing like silver lightning through the heavy canvas and wool. She sat by the fire, the light casting a golden halo around her raven hair, working with a concentration that made Thorn pause in his own labors just to watch her. He would sit in his leather armchair, a book resting forgotten on his knee, mesmerized by the delicate strength in her fingers, fingers that had once been blue with death but were now nimble and warm. The romance between them was not spoken in sonnets but in the language of service. One evening, Thorn returned from the stables with a bundle of smooth cedar planks under his arm. Without a word, he spent the night measuring and sawing, the sound of his labor filling the room with a comfortable noise. By morning, he had constructed a sturdy, gentle ramp leading from the main room to the porch, and another leading down to the garden patch that was just beginning to peek through the frost. He didn't announce it with fanfare. He simply walked over to where she sat, scooped her up with that familiar, breathtaking ease, and carried her to a cushioned chair he had placed on the porch. "Fresh air," he rumbled, looking out at the mountains rather than at her, "is good for the blood." Mai looked at the ramp, then at the man who stood like a sentinel beside her. Tears welled in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that he had reshaped his world to fit her brokenness. She reached out, her hand hovering before settling tentatively on his forearm. The muscle beneath the sleeve tensed, then relaxed, accepting her touch. It was the first time she had initiated contact, a soft, silent thank you that echoed louder than any shout. The peace of their isolation was fractured on a Tuesday, the day the mail coach finally broke through the mud-slicked roads to the valley below. Thorn had ridden down to the settlement for supplies, leaving Mai with a loaded rifle within reach, a testament to the danger of the frontier and his trust in her fierce will to survive. When he returned, the air in the cabin shifted, heavy with an unspoken threat. He moved with a restless energy, pacing the floorboards like a caged panther. Mai watched him from her spot by the hearth, sensing the storm brewing behind his storm-colored eyes. Finally, he spoke, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated in her chest. "There's talk in town," he said, turning to face her. "The man who left you." The merchant Mai felt her blood turn to ice. The memory of the wagon, the cold, and the cruel laugh of her intended husband came rushing back, suffocating her. She gripped the arms of her chair until her knuckles turned white. Thorn saw the terror seize her, and in 2 strides, he was kneeling before her, engulfing her small trembling hands in his massive, calloused ones. He's telling people you died, Thorne said, his voice dropping to a fierce whisper. He's playing the grieving victim to garner sympathy and credit at the store. He doesn't know you're here. The intimacy of the moment was intense. His face was inches from hers, his eyes searching hers for the strength he knew was there. He will not touch you, my. I would burn this mountain to ash before I let him near you. The promise hung in the air, absolute and terrifying. For the first time, Mai saw not just a savior, but a man who had claimed her as his own, not as property, but as a precious, vital part of his existence. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of rain and leather. I am not afraid, she lied, her voice shaking. As long as I am with you. Thorne brought a hand up to stroke her hair, a gesture so tender it felt like a caress of the soul. You are with me, he vowed. Always. The confrontation was inevitable, a collision of past and present that arrived with the rumble of a carriage wheel. A week later, a fancy rig pulled up the muddy drive, carrying the town sheriff and the merchant, a man named Mr. Gantry. Gantry was a slick, corpulent man in a suit that cost more than a farm, his face flushed with the arrogance of petty power. They had come on a rumor, a whisper from a stable boy who had seen Thorne buying bolts of pink silk. Thorne met them on the porch, his body a barricade blocking the door. He didn't hold a weapon, he didn't need to. His very presence was a threat. Mai sat just inside the open door, hidden by the shadows, listening, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. We heard tell of a woman, Gantry sneered, his voice oily and false. A crippled thing. My property, as it happens. I feared she had perished, but if she is here, I have come to collect her. She has debts to work off, legs or no legs. The sheriff looked uncomfortable, shifting in his saddle, but Gantry pressed on, stepping onto the first step of the porch. Thorne didn't flinch. He didn't shout. He simply stepped down one level, placing himself chest to chest with the smaller man, looking down with a disdain that could wither crops. There is no property here, Thorne said, his voice a low growl that sounded like stones grinding together. There is only the lady of this house. And she is not for the likes of you. Gantry laughed, a shrill, nervous sound. Lady? The cripple? She's damaged goods, Thorne. Worthless. Inside the cabin, Mai heard the word, worthless, and something inside her snapped. It was not a break, but a hardening. She grabbed her walking stick, dragged herself to the doorway, and pulled herself upright against the frame. She stood there, swaying slightly, beautiful and fierce in the dress Thorne had given her. I am not goods, she called out, her voice clear and ringing like a bell in the crisp air. Gantry's jaw dropped. Thorne turned to look at her, and the pride on his face was so radiant it almost blinded her. He looked back at Gantry. Get off my land, Thorne said softly. Before I forget that I am a civilized man. The threat was final. Gantry, sensing the violence coiling in Thorne's muscles, scrambled back to the carriage, retreating like a beaten cur. The following Sunday, the town of Silver Creek witnessed a sight that would be etched into local legend for decades to come. Thorne, the recluse who despised society, rode into town not alone, but driving a fine buckboard wagon. Beside him sat Mai. She was not hiding. She wore a dress of deep crimson silk, a color of luck and joy in her culture, her hair pinned up with combs of silver. She held her head high, her posture regal despite the paralysis that bound her legs. Thorne stopped the wagon in front of the church just as the service was letting out. The crowd fell silent. The townspeople, who had whispered and judged, who had locked their doors against a starving girl, now stared in awe. Thorne climbed down and walked around to her side. He did not hustle her out of sight. He lifted her down with deliberate, reverent slowness, holding her close to his chest for a moment longer than necessary, letting the whole town see the way he looked at her, as if she were the sun and he was the earth turning toward her. He placed her in her wheelchair, a custom creation he had spent nights building, with wheels that moved smoothly over the boardwalk. He pushed her into the general store, the bell chiming brightly. He bought her the finest chocolates, new ribbons, and books. When the shopkeeper's wife, a woman who had once turned Mai away, stammered a greeting, Mai met her gaze with a calm, forgiving grace. Good day to you, Mai said softly. It was the ultimate vindication. She did not scream or rage, she simply existed, thriving and loved, in the face of their cruelty. Thorn stood beside her, his hand resting protectively on the back of her chair, his glare daring anyone to show disrespect. In that moment, the town realized that the monster on the mountain possessed more humanity than all of them combined, and the crippled girl possessed more dignity than they could ever hope to buy. The ride back to the ranch was bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, the sky painted in hues of violet and burnt orange. The tension of the public display had melted away, leaving a quiet, vibrating intimacy between them. When they arrived home, Thorn did not take her inside immediately. He carried her to the porch swing, sitting beside her as the twilight deepened over the valley. The air was cooling, but the warmth between them was palpable. Thorn took his hat off, turning it in his large hands, looking vulnerable for the first time. "I've lived alone for a long time," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Thought that was how it had to be. Thought I was too much for anyone to handle. Too hard. Too cold." He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the first stars appearing in the sky. "But you bring the spring with you." I felt the tears finally spill over, hot and cleansing. She reached out and took his face in her hands, feeling the rough stubble of his jaw, the warmth of his skin. "You are not cold," she whispered. "You are the fire that saved me. You are my home." Thorn closed his eyes at her touch, leaning into her palm. He turned his face and pressed a kiss to the center of her hand, a gesture of absolute devotion. Then, slowly, he leaned in, and their lips met, a soft, tentative collision that deepened into a promise. It was not a kiss of burning passion, but of deep, abiding relief, the sealing of a bond forged in ice and tempered by kindness. They sat there as the night took the world, two broken souls who had found that their jagged edges fit together perfectly, making them whole. The wind blew across the plains, but it no longer shrieked, it sang, a lullaby for the rancher and his bride, who had found salvation in each other's arms.